Hello, greetings to you all. My name is Antonio Ballesteros González. I'm professor of English at the UNED, which is the Spanish University of Distance Education. And I hope that this presentation finds you well. I want to begin this talk by thanking Dr. Asun Lopez Varela for kindly inviting me to address you through the invaluable support of the Eurasia Foundation. The vampire myth has incarnated in a profound sense the changes and transformations of humankind within the cultural framework of all times. Embedded in our dreams since ancestral and atavistic eras, the protean capacity of the vampire has given rise to a multiplicity of metamorphoses within the spheres of literature, art, and popular culture, the ambits where these alluring creatures proliferate, trespassing the boundaries of other locations, other frontiers, and other semantic dimensions. Being a liminal and ubiquitous character, as Nina Auerbach brilliantly analyzed, each period of history is represented by its own vampires, which adapt themselves in perfect symbiosis to the ideological substratum and the collective unconscious of each specific chronological lapse. Vampire history is, therefore, human history. Vampires portray our concerns and anxieties, our deepest and sometimes most ineffable desires. They are the genuine representatives of both human fears and fascinations. The vampire is the double, the doppelganger of the society in which it, originally a neutral being, penetrates, whether consciously or unconsciously. Like all great myths, vampires till Dracula and beyond connect with our human essence and, in this same vein, become a symbol, an emblem of immortality, of an eternal life rooted in ambiguity and darkness, in the shadow that they did not cast and or projected in obscure ways. The vampire, a transcultural and cross-cultural figure, an image of the undead, has acquired new life recently thanks to neo-Victorian and post-human revisions of the myth. As Marie-Louise Kolke and Christian Goodleven convincingly stated, quote, "Neo-Victorianism is by nature quintessentially Gothic," end of quote, and consequently, Gothic images and anxieties have permeated the pages of both neo-Victorian narratives and critical writings. Curiously enough, vampires have been paid less critical attention in neo-Victorian studies than other Gothic monsters and fantastic characters, especially ghosts. Haunting and spectrality have been successfully and beautifully analyzed in invaluable theoretical contributions so far, like particularly those contained in the volumes written and or edited by Louisa Hadley, Rosario Arias and Patricia Pullen, Anne Heilman, Mark Llewellyn, and Marie-Louise Kolke and Christian Goodleven. On the other hand, Sigrid Cordell has carried out an intriguing analysis of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula as neo-Victorian epitome of early cinema. Judith Wild has written an engaging comparative analysis of theatricality in Les Miserables, Sweeney Todd and Anne Rice's interview with the vampire, and Marie-Louise Kolke has devoted a fascinating article to the demon lover, a character that can claim some analogies with the vampire. Without any intention to diminish the symbolic relevance of ghosts in the neo-Victorian sphere, in my view vampires should generate more critical interest, mainly because, using a convenient and maybe hyperbolic metaphor, the task of neo-Victorian writers and theorists can be seen as no other than vampirizing the Victorian past, aesthetically and academically preying on Victorian texts and cultures, so much invaded by polysemous creatures of the night. The figure of the vampire, also elusive like that of the ghost, lurking at the threshold between the past and the present, going forward and looking backward, as Mark Llewellyn plainly and sagaciously stated when referring to the field of Neo-Victorian studies, adequately and accurately reflects the fundamental artistic and cultural tenets of Neo-Victorianism. As a cross-cultural myth, there is no place in the whole earth whose folklore and traditions do not witness the presence of the vampire, maintaining links with the popular, with highbrow and lowbrow culture, and with otherness and marginality since its remote genesis. As an icon of many different aspects of reality, the vampire was connected with death rites, disease, and epidemics, a symbolic association related to the dreadful situation we are now living, which was applicable in the past, for instance, to the bubonic plague, syphilis, and AIDS. Vampires and plagues have been metaphorically associated since ancient times. The vampire crossed the threshold of history through its identification with historical and at the same time legendary characters like Vlad Tepes and Elizabeth Bathory, the so-called Bloody Countess, conspicuous paradigms of medieval and early modern psychopaths. But these creatures of the night reached cultural prominence in the Enlightenment period, the purported age of reason, in which paradoxically enough, fantasy flourished and the Gothic as a genre was born. In 1751, Don Augustin Calmet, a French Dominican friar, explored the strange vampire epidemics, as they were called, which allegedly occurred in Eastern Europe, compiling and analyzing a plethora of case studies from a critical Christian perspective. Surreptitiously, the realm of imagination invaded the sphere of reason. As Francisco de Goya brilliantly illustrated, the dream of reason brings forth monsters. Fantasy became the double, that other side of realism, a process that in Great Britain reached its climax in the 19th century and, more distinctively, in the Victorian era. The vampire turned into an emblem of cultural otherness, an icon of enchantment, of strangeness and horror, defying archetypes of reason and logic. Throughout the following arguments, I will attempt to briefly delineate and trace how the vampire underwent a gradual process of disenchantment in the Anglo-American context, ranging from the Romantic period to contemporary postmodern and neo-Victorian recreations of the myth. For practical reasons, I will be paying attention mostly to fictional works and films and TV series, leaving aside other forms of popular culture, like graphic novels, for instance. All early vampires paved their way to the Victorian summits of the Gothic subgenre, although the genesis of the literary vampire, as is well known, is a Romantic phenomenon. Polidori's The Vampire, born at the same time as Frankenstein's monster, can be considered the first vampire narrative in Western history. This récit à clef, the literary revenge of Polidori, depicts Lord Byron, under the pseudonym of Lord Ruthven, as an aristocratic vampire whose favorite physical and psychological victims are women. However, through the character of Aubrey, the narrator, Polidori envisages the anxieties related to Byron, his employer, who, ironically, and to his utter outrage, was considered the author of the tale when it was first published in France in 1819. The evocative atmosphere of the short story, taking place mostly in Rome and Greece, brings about a sense of estrangement, of das Unheimliche, the Freudian term translated into English as the uncanny, or meaning the unholy. Nevertheless, terror as a state of the mind related to the vampire figure can be more evidently perceived in the femme fatale concocted by Edgar Allan Poe on the other side of the Atlantic. Ligeia, Berenice, Morella, Madeleine Usher, more revenants than archetypal vampires, epitomize double otherness and as elusive female monsters related to masculine fears in a claustrophobic world of patriarchal nightmares and obscure desires. They are enchanted creatures that produced unsettling feelings in, prototypically, the male reader. Through James Malcolm Rymer's Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood, published in 1847, the vampire broke into the domain of popular culture by appearing in installments, in the prototypical serialized form of Victorian times. This blockbuster was linked to Polidori's tale and became a forerunner of Dracula in introducing another aristocratic vampire, the first one that feeds on blood, because Lord Ruthven was rather a kind of psychological vampire that drained his female victims of vital energy. Although Varney cannot be properly considered a horror story, it constitutes an essential landmark in popularizing the vampire myth, opening new trends in vampire literature and culture, and leading to the Victorian golden age of this Gothic subgenre. Understandably enough, the most significant representatives of vampire writing in the context of Victorian Britain were authors coming from marginal, other places of the British Empire. Malcolm Rymer was Scot, and Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, the writer of Carmilla, was an Irishman, like his friend Bram Stoker. Le Fanu contributed to vampire literature one of the most unsettling paradigms through the portrayal of a lesbian vampire that victimizes Laura, the adolescent narrator of the short story. In spite of his hasty ending, in which a patriarchal exorcist destroys the dangerous female vampire, in a plot abounding with subtle Irish colonial connotations, in spite of being located in Styria, the disturbing tale examines from a subconscious and symbolic perspective the no woman's land of female adolescent sexual awakening. In its atmospheric recreation and its spectral narrative economy, Carmilla is one of the most frightening vampire stories ever written, thus playing an essential role in the process of enchantment of the female vampire figure. In its projection and recreation of horror, among other characteristics, Dracula, the vampiric turning point and climax, owes a lot to Le Fanu's nightmarish tale. Bram Stoker's novel reflects the anxieties and obsessions of the Victorian fin de siècle, permeated by diverse ambiguities and complexities. The elusive Count and his hideous progeny become emblems of absolute otherness from different perspectives. First of all, for instance, social otherness. Dracula is a representative of the ancient feudal aristocracy, the spectre that, according to Marx and Engels at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, was haunting Europe. The vampire is eventually perceived as capital. Also, racial and ethnic otherness. The Count is described with Jewish characteristics and also as a bestial archetype, the product of Darwinian nightmares. Colonial otherness. The vampire comes from Eastern Europe to invade and infect the West. And, finally, among others, sexual otherness. Female vampires, sexually assertive and voluptuous, turn into the instruments of patriarchal powers, paradoxically subverting them. Dracula is the catalyst of female desire at the same time that he represents sexual and political invasion scare in the background of Imperial Britain. For, as he states in Stoker's narrative, what he ultimately pursues is nothing but transforming men in vampires, uttering alarming messages like, "This man belongs to me," or "Your girls that you all love are mine already," implying that, through them, the male members of Van Helsing's crew of light will be his too. Leaving aside the homoerotic nuances of these assertions, the important thing is to notice that Dracula, never to be fully apprehended by Van Helsing's acolytes, in spite of their use of high technological writing weapons and the massive accumulation of documents, rejects all attempts to be physically and metaphorically grasped by his antagonists, and accordingly by the readers of Stoker's novel. Dracula and his vampiric kith and kin reach the high points of fears and enchantments associated to the vampire myth, and the novel was universally read by late Victorian reviewers as a narrative of utter horror. After such literary and cultural pinnacle, it is only logical to think that the literary vampire would languish in the following decades, despite some relevant exceptions, of course. No vampire after Dracula, whether consciously or unconsciously, can get rid of its central and essential influence. However, vampires are mutable and chameleonic creatures, and they always adapt to new circumstances and artistic manifestations. After Stoker's literary achievement, vampires proliferated in the cinema, passing from the page onto the screen, from the old to the new world. The transition was represented by Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau's Nosferatu, literally the bearer of the plague, the 1922 expressionist silent film, and the first significant neo-Victorian adaptation of Stoker's text. As a matter of fact, the film was banned after prosecution for charges of plagiarism. In it, the vampire, played by Max Schreck, is clearly recognizable as the Jew, the epitome of utter otherness in after-war Germany, identified with greediness and the hunger for money. Early American cinematographic vampires feature Western equivalents of the vampiric figure. Bela Lugosi's hieratic, monolithic Dracula in Todd Browning's film, 1931, stresses the hypnotic magnetism of his eyes and his melodramatic performance, in keeping with the script of the film, based on the early 20th century play by Hamilton Dean and John L. Balderston of 1924-1927, not on Stoker's novel. This has been a recurrent characteristic to date of revisions of the Dracula myth, which have never been fully faithful to the original source, although many of them have coincided in maintaining a neo-Gothic and neo-Victorian atmosphere. In any case, each particular period of contemporary history has had its own Dracula, producing fears in each specific audience. Terence Fisher's Horror of Dracula, 1958, featuring Christopher Lee in the leading role of the Count, was a dynamic, muscular, impressive vampire, the first in Technicolor, emphasizing the fetishism of blood and the Art Deco neo-Victorian sets recurrent in Hammer films. Radically different is John Badham's Dracula of 1979, where Frank Langella performs a romantic vampire, the catalyst of female desire, in an explicit neo-Victorian context. This wide-ranging evolution of the vampire figure has contributed to the gradual orientation towards disenchantment, in which the creatures of the night have been involved, especially appreciated in postmodern American revisions of the myth. Political horror in Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, led to social horror in Stephen King's Salem's Lot, which depicts the terrifying menace of Barlow, the European, neo-Victorian, and monstrous vampire, destabilizing the apparent tranquility of an all-American small town, projecting the fears of external and internal evils. King's blockbuster and the films based on it, chiefly Tobe Hooper's version, is possibly the last narrative of vampiric terror to date, also, together with Matheson's narrative, inadvertently predicting the zombie's substitution of the vampire in contemporary horror. From a completely different standpoint, Anne Rice's interview with the vampire and the other books of the highly successful Vampire Chronicles introduce transnational, sexually ambiguous, queer, global vampires, depicting a sort of colonization in reverse, in which vampiric genealogies are female, the same as the author of the saga. The postmodern pioneer of many women writers of vampire literature, turning the subgenre in an almost exclusive female domain, teeming with apparently empowered female characters. On the other hand, Rice's first part of her prolific saga proves Kolke and Goodleven's statement that one of the shared tropes between the Gothic and the Neo-Victorian is, quote, the trace of lost manuscripts, documents, histories, and voices, end of quote. These vampires assumed the confessional mode, and for the first time in cultural history, with Fred Saberhagen's The Dracula Tape, 1975, as illustrious forerunner, they speak and share their feelings and concerns, implying their transformative capacity of living in the postmodern, neo-Victorian world, adopting peculiar sexual and social manners, as shown in Louis, Lestat, and Claudia's atypical vampire family in Interview with the Vampire. The technology that Stoker's Dracula abhorred is now the principal vehicle for the vampire to expand, the media and the internet being essentially vampiric. As Nina Auerbach wisely affirms, quote, vampires go where power is, end of quote. And today's power obviously resides in the technologies of information and communication. In her postmodern vampire epic, Rice portrays disenchanted, domesticated, multicultural, and, ultimately, humanized vampires, connecting with vampiric readers and audiences eager to devour bestsellers, films, TV series, merchandising, and other forms of popular culture. The vampire becomes a commodity in the late capitalist context, devoid of all those features that made it an emblem, an icon of terror. As Theodore Tsiolkovsky beautifully explains in Disenchanted Images Towards a Literary Iconology of 1976, human communities submit all those paradigms of fear and uneasiness to a process of disenchantment, divesting them of their enthralling and terrifying powers. Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula of 1992, a misleading and manipulative title, has arguably provided a relevant example in this respect. Visually and artistically remarkable, this neo-Victorian film, in my view, constitutes the swan song of the vampire as a symbol of terror, in spite of some impressive and shocking scenes, counterpointed by the film's motto, "Love never dies." By transforming Stoker's ambiguous and frightening narrative into, ultimately, a love story, the vampire turns into the epitome of romantic love, leading to subsequent revisions in this respect. The most conspicuous is undoubtedly Stephenie Meyer's The Twilight Saga, Twilight, New Moon, Eclipse, Breaking Dawn, which, not devoid of interesting intertextual links with other vampire narratives, and other Victorian novels like Wuthering Heights, as is the case of the second part of the saga, exploits, in my opinion, a neo-Puritan and conservative image of the vampire, a commodity for teenagers who will probably never visualize the creatures of the night as icons of terror. In spite of vitriolic parodies, memes, and jokes, comparing Twilight with other paradigms of horror, it can be affirmed that the disenchanting seed of the vampiric saga is implicitly perceived in some of its precursors, like Coppola's film, and of course I am not dealing here with the artistic quality of each exponent, but with their ideological and cultural projection in our contemporary times. Although there have been some serious attempts to inoculate again fear and terror into the vampire myth, mainly from a cinematographic perspective, like Let Me In, based on an impressive Swedish novel and film, Let the Right One In, most vampiric revisions amount to instances of this process of decadence and the orientation towards disenchantment that I am referring to. For example, there have been multiple representations of vampire hunters as superheroes, with the figure of Van Helsing in both the eponymous film and television series as the most representative epitome. The film is precisely a veritable paradigm of neo-Victorian visual aesthetics and steampunk. Many of these visual performances focus on vampires fighting werewolves, a recurrent obsession, and also taking place in Twilight. And this is also the case of Blade and Underworld, where the image of the empowered heroine is gradually emphasized. The same as in a multiplicity of popular literary and television series like Buffy Vampire Hunter and True Blood, based on Charlene Harris's Dead Until Dark. Some American films introduce the vampire hunter in the context of deeply rooted obsessions with continental otherness, as for example From Dusk Till Dawn, a frontier nightmare, we could say, where Mexican vampires paradoxically menaced the US violent invader. There are also films in this regard which replicate the aesthetics of the Western, like John Carpenter's Vampires, and, last but not least, in a climatic turn of the screw, even the illustrious Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, became a vampire hunter on the screen, symbolically fighting Southern vampires as the embodiment of the forces of evil linked to slavery. In this ascension towards vampiric deliriums and disenchantment, it is no surprise to find that Dracula himself has become a superhero in the 2014 film of the same title. As a counterpoint to these versions, there have been some other more serious and self-conscious attempts to infuse the vampire myth with new semantic blood, as is the case of The Hunger of 1983, a film based on the eponymous novel by Whitley Strieber, a manifestation of predatory sexual practices enfolded in an atmosphere of sophisticated decadence. Jim Jarmusch's indie film Only Lovers Left Alive, 2013, also features decadent, crepuscular vampires that symbolize the postmodern condition with existential inferences. Some attempts to subvert the vampiric canon and preconceived ideas about otherness from a gendered feminist perspective deserve some mentioning here, as is the case of Joel Gomez's The Gilda Stories, which portrays female vampires at the sexual and racial margins, disenchanted inheritors or inheritresses of Lephanus Carmilla, that emphasize the multiple otherness of a lesbian African-American vampire detective who has escaped from slavery, also transgressing temporal barriers. This narrative and other exponents of feminist vampires, as for instance the collections Night Bites and Daughters of Darkness Lesbian Vampire Tales, edited respectively by Victoria Bronsworth and Pam Kesey, focus on the illustration of desire from the point of view of female vampires, underlining again feminist and lesbian empowerment. In general terms, and I insist in this important point, vampire fiction has become the almost exclusive sphere of influence of female writers. If this fact has something to do with the gradual process of disenchantment which vampires have been subject to in present times, is a controversial issue that would deserve attentive scrutiny. Although deprived of fear-provoking connotations, narratives like Susie McKee Charnas's The Vampire Tapestry of 1980 constitute an original attempt to reflect the vampire in a mirror of apparently unremarkable quotidian life, despoiled of supernatural elements. Other female writers, like Elizabeth Kostova in The Historian of 2005, have opted for recovering the historical vampire, tracing a balance between history and myth. Furthermore, some female vampire narratives contain evident neo-Victorian connotations, as is the case of Dodie Bellamy's The Letters of Mina Harker of 1998, a purportedly feminist rewriting of Stoker's Dracula from Mina's viewpoint, who, after becoming a vampire, describes her 4 love affairs from the Victorian times to the present. Sequels and versions of classical vampire literature in general, and of the vampire novel par excellence in particular, of Dracula, are proliferating in recent times, as for example Dracula the Undead, a gruesome and scarcely inspired follow-up written by Dacre Stoker, Brand's great-grandnephew, and Ian Holt. And television series backed up by relevant media platforms like Netflix or HBO could not remain unaware to new adaptations of Bram Stoker's masterpiece. This is the case of the long-awaited BBC Dracula of 2019, which remains a disputable, a controversial attempt. Aesthetically alluring, his representation of Count Dracula as an eccentric, hyperbolic, ironic character who delves into touches of black comedy has become a bone of contention between vampiric purists and more supposedly open-minded spectators. What is clear is that this Dracula is anything but frightening. It is another example of disenchantment, in my opinion. In conclusion, Neo-Victorianism has undeniably infused new life and trends into the vampire myth, but on the whole they are disenchanted, demythologized images. Oddly enough, in the age of post-humanism, vampires have lost their fantastic and terrifying appeal to become, in most cases, especially blockbusters and popular television series, more human than human, in spite of the vestiges of brainless and bestial counterparts like the gory vampires in Penny Dreadful, the quintessence of the neo-Victorian, neo-Gothic television series. The ghastly vampiric seed that culminated in Stoker's Dracula has been substituted in the Gothic imaginary by another less appealing figure, attractive figure, more in keeping with the uncertain times we are living in, the zombie. And this must be significant, but this is another story. You did what to vampires? Bram Stoker would be entitled and justified to ask from his once safe Victorian realm of vampiric horror. And that's all. Thank you so much for your attention. It's been a real pleasure. And please stay healthy and go on listening to the music of the creatures of the night. Thank you.